In 1922, a German housewife needed a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a single loaf of bread. By 1923, the entire wealth of the German middle class had evaporated in what historians would call the greatest peacetime destruction of purchasing power in modern history. What most people don't know is that Germany's collapse followed a precise pattern, a 7-phase sequence that has repeated itself across empires for the last 2,000 years. Today, the United States has just entered phase 5 of the same pattern, and the historical record suggests we have approximately 18 to 36 months before the transition to phase 6 becomes irreversible. The pattern isn't a theory or a prediction. It's a documented historical framework observed in the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Spanish Empire, the disintegration of the British pound's global dominance, and the hyperinflation that destroyed the Weimar Republic. Every major economic superpower that has declined in recorded history moved through these 7 distinct phases, each phase marked by specific fiscal behaviors, monetary decisions, and social responses that created the conditions for the next phase. The United States entered phase 1 in 1971, progressed steadily through phases 2, 3, and 4, and crossed into phase 5 in March 2023 when the Federal Reserve intervened to prevent a cascading banking crisis that would have collapsed 17 regional banks in 72 hours. The 7-phase breakdown follows an economic logic so consistent that once you understand it, you can identify where any nation sits on the spectrum. Phase 1 begins when a dominant economic power abandons hard currency constraints, typically moving from asset-backed money to fiat currency that can be created without physical limitations. Phase 2 emerges when the government begins running persistent deficits, funding current expenses with borrowed money rather than collected revenue, creating a structural dependency on debt. Phase 3 arrives when the cost of servicing existing debt begins consuming an ever larger share of tax revenue, forcing governments to choose between cutting essential services or borrowing more to pay interest on previous borrowing. Phase 4 represents the acceleration point where the central bank must actively intervene in bond markets to keep interest rates artificially suppressed, because natural market rates would make the debt burden mathematically unsustainable. Phase 5 begins when the financial system itself becomes unstable, requiring emergency interventions and bailouts to prevent cascading failures, marking the transition from controllable debt to systemic fragility. Phase 6 is the crisis phase, characterized by either hyperinflation, sudden currency devaluation, or default, where the government loses the ability to control monetary outcomes. Phase 7 is the resolution, which historically takes one of 3 forms: complete currency replacement, political restructuring through revolution or conquest, or a multi-generational period of diminished living standards as the economy slowly rebuilds. The most instructive example is Britain between 1914 and 1976, because it demonstrates how a global superpower can move through all 7 phases while remaining a functioning democracy. In 1914, the British pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, backed by gold, financing roughly 60% of global trade. Britain entered phase 1 in 1931 when it permanently abandoned the gold standard after temporarily suspending it during World War I, transitioning to a pure fiat currency system managed by the Bank of England. Phase 2 emerged during World War II, when Britain's national debt exploded from 125% of GDP in 1939 to 248% by 1947, as the government borrowed massively to fund military operations. The war ended with Britain victorious but financially exhausted, owing enormous debts to the United States and facing independence movements across its colonial holdings. Phase 3 materialized in the 1950s, when debt service consumed over 20% of government revenue, forcing Britain to choose between maintaining its global military presence and funding domestic social programs. The British government entered Phase 4 in 1961, when the Bank of England began direct intervention in gilt markets, purchasing government bonds to keep interest rates below the level private markets would demand. This represented the critical transition, where market discipline broke down and monetary policy became subordinated to fiscal necessity. Phase 5 arrived in 1967 when the pound faced a severe currency crisis, forcing a 14% devaluation despite massive intervention by the Bank of England and support from international central banks. Phase 6 struck between 1972 and 1976 when Britain experienced simultaneous inflation above 25% and negative economic growth, a condition that economists had previously considered theoretically impossible. The crisis culminated in 1976, when Britain was forced to request an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, the first time a major developed economy had required IMF intervention since the organization's founding. Phase 7 began with the economic restructuring of the 1980s, which required 2 decades of painful adjustment, the dismantling of Britain's industrial base, and the permanent loss of the pound's status as a global reserve currency. The entire sequence from Phase 1 to Phase 7 took 45 years, but the critical period from Phase 4 to Phase 6 lasted only 15 years. Once Britain reached Phase 5 in 1967, the progression to full crisis in Phase 6 took less than a decade, demonstrating how the later phases accelerate rapidly. The British case is particularly relevant because it shows that even gradual managed decline through democratic processes still produces severe disruption, currency devaluation, and a permanent reduction in living standards for the average citizen. The transition wasn't catastrophic in a single moment, but the cumulative effect over 2 decades fundamentally transformed Britain from a global superpower into a regional economy. The United States entered Phase 1 on August 15, 1971, when President Richard Nixon closed the gold window, ending the Bretton Woods system and transforming the dollar into pure fiat currency. For the first time in American history, the dollar was backed by nothing except the government's promise and the military and economic power to enforce global dollar usage. Phase 2 began in earnest in 2001, when the federal government stopped running surpluses and entered permanent deficit spending, a situation that has continued for 22 consecutive years, regardless of which political party controlled Congress or the White House. The transition to Phase 3 occurred gradually between 2008 and 2015, but became unmistakable by 2019 when interest payments on federal debt exceeded $380 billion annually, consuming over 8% of all federal tax revenue. By 2023, interest payments reached $659 billion, surpassing defense spending and becoming the second largest federal expenditure after Social Security. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2033, interest payments will reach $1.4 trillion annually, consuming over 15% of all federal revenue and exceeding the entire defense budget by a factor of 2. Phase 4 became official policy in March 2020 when the Federal Reserve announced unlimited quantitative easing, effectively promising to purchase as many Treasury bonds as necessary to keep interest rates near zero. Between March 2020 and March 2022, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from $4.2 trillion to $8.9 trillion, an increase larger than the entire money supply of Japan. This represented direct monetization of federal debt, the central bank creating new money to buy government bonds that private markets were unwilling to purchase at the artificially low interest rates the government required. The United States entered Phase 5 in March 2023 during the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic Bank. These failures triggered a systemic crisis that required the Federal Reserve to create the Bank Term Funding Program, an emergency facility that provided $152 billion in loans to prevent cascading bank failures across the regional banking sector. The critical marker of Phase 5 isn't just that banks failed, but that the government's response revealed the financial system could no longer withstand normal interest rate adjustments without emergency intervention. What makes America's position in Phase 5 particularly precarious is the scale and speed of recent monetary expansion. The Federal Reserve increased the money supply by 40% between January 2020 and December 2021, the fastest peacetime monetary expansion in American history. This occurred while the federal debt increased from $23 trillion in 2019 to $34 trillion in 2024, an addition of $11 trillion in just 5 years. For context, it took the United States 205 years, from 1776 to 1981, to accumulate its first $1 trillion of debt. The mathematical reality is straightforward and unforgiving. At current projections, the United States will add another $20 trillion in debt over the next decade, pushing total federal debt above $54 trillion by 2034. If interest rates remain at their current average of 4.5%, annual interest payments will exceed $2.4 trillion, consuming over 25% of all federal tax revenue. This creates an impossible situation where the government must choose between defaulting on obligations, dramatically cutting essential services, or inflating the currency to reduce the real value of debt. History provides clear guidance about what happens once a nation enters Phase 5, and the timeline is disturbingly consistent. From Britain's entry into Phase 5 in 1967 to its IMF crisis in 1976 was 9 years. From Germany's entry into Phase 5 in 1921 to hyperinflation in 1923 was 2 years. From Argentina's entry into Phase 5 in 1999 to its complete default in 2001 was 2 years. The pattern suggests that once systemic financial instability requires emergency intervention, the window before reaching Phase 6 crisis ranges from 18 months to 10 years, with an average of approximately 4 years. The specific trigger that pushes a nation from Phase 5 into Phase 6 varies, but it always involves a loss of confidence in either the currency or the government's ability to meet obligations. For Britain, it was the combination of inflation and a current account crisis that made the pound unsustainable at existing exchange rates. For Germany, it was the French occupation of the Ruhr industrial region that destroyed tax revenue while debt obligations remained fixed. For Argentina, it was the combination of a fixed exchange rate and mounting debt that created an obvious contradiction markets could exploit. For the United States, the most likely triggers are a sovereign debt crisis sparked by a failed Treasury auction, a currency crisis driven by foreign central banks reducing dollar reserves, or a systemic banking crisis that overwhelms the Federal Reserve's ability to provide liquidity. Each of these scenarios becomes more probable as debt levels rise, as interest costs consume more revenue, and as the Federal Reserve's balance sheet becomes increasingly constrained by previous interventions. The progression isn't guaranteed, but it becomes increasingly difficult to avoid as the mathematical contradictions compound. What Phase 6 looks like for a reserve currency nation has only one modern precedent: Britain between 1972 and 1976. The British experience suggests a crisis characterized by simultaneous high inflation, economic contraction, currency devaluation, and political instability. For average citizens, this manifested as rapidly declining purchasing power, unemployment above 10%, frequent strikes, energy shortages, and a pervasive sense that the social contract was breaking down. The British government imposed a 3-day workweek in 1974 to conserve electricity, and by 1976, inflation reached 25%, while real wages fell by over 15%. The critical difference is that Britain in the 1970s was a declining power that could be rescued by external actors, specifically the United States and the International Monetary Fund. The United States today is the global reserve currency, representing over 58% of world foreign exchange reserves and the denomination for approximately 80% of global trade. There is no external actor large enough or powerful enough to provide a rescue if the dollar system itself enters crisis. China's economy is too structurally dependent on dollar-based trade, Europe is facing its own debt sustainability challenges, and no combination of nations has the capacity to replace dollar liquidity in global markets. This means Phase 6 for the United States would likely be more severe and more globally disruptive than any previous reserve currency transition. The breakdown of the dollar system would simultaneously impact global trade, commodity pricing, emerging market debt, and international capital flows. Historical precedent suggests this adjustment would not be smooth or gradual, but rather would occur through a series of acute crises, each one forcing emergency responses that create the conditions for the next crisis. The cascading nature of these failures would amplify each subsequent shock, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of deteriorating confidence and economic disruption. The conventional wisdom holds that the United States dollar is too big to fail, that the global economy is too dependent on dollar stability for any major disruption to occur, and that American economic and military power guarantees the system's continuation. This is almost exactly the same conventional wisdom that existed about the British pound in 1960, about the gold standard in 1925, and about every dominant reserve currency system before its collapse. The pattern of decline doesn't announce itself with obvious signals. It reveals itself through subtle structural changes that seem manageable until suddenly they aren't. The contrarian insight is that Phase 5 is simultaneously the most dangerous phase and the last phase where individual preparation can make a material difference. Once a nation enters Phase 6, capital controls, bank restrictions, and currency limitations typically make it difficult or impossible for average citizens to protect themselves. The historical record shows that wealth preservation strategies implemented during Phase 5 determine which families emerge from the crisis with resources intact, and which families see generational wealth evaporate. The window isn't infinite, but it's also not yet closed. What history teaches most clearly is that these transitions are not binary events, but processes that unfold over years, creating both catastrophic losses and extraordinary opportunities for those who understand the pattern. The 7-phase framework isn't a prophecy, it's a map. And unlike the citizens of Weimar Germany in 1922 or Britain in 1967, we have the advantage of seeing the map before reaching the destination. The question isn't whether America is in Phase 5, the evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is what you do with that information while Phase 6 is still 18 to 36 months away. The pattern has repeated itself for 2,000 years, and there's no historical evidence suggesting this time will be different. The only variable is whether you recognize the pattern while there's still time to prepare, or whether you join the long list of citizens throughout history who believed their empire was the exception.